Anyhow, welcome everyone. Feel free to, stop, ask questions in the chat, or just speak up as we go through the meeting. We're going to talk about a few things today. We're going to talk about the labor market, the president's budget for fiscal year 2024, which begins October 1st, the latest reports about Social Security and Medicare funding, some of the latest information about inflation and wages, some discussion of the banking system drama, Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, et cetera, as well as other than economic statistics and what we can do in terms of action. The labor market employment report came out last Friday, and it was pretty darn good. Jobs were up 236,000, which is down from prior months, but still solid if you compare it to pre-pandemic months. There were minor adjustments to January and February. Job creation under Biden is averaging an incredible 485,000 a month. And most importantly, we have a record number of jobs, about 3 million more jobs than we had the pre-pandemic peak. So we're in good shape on the jobs front. That is, talked about here. Job growth is slowing down a little bit, which is actually what the Fed wants it to do so that we don't have as much upward pressure on inflation. Just a little comparison of job growth under Biden and then job growth under, prior presidents. Trump, we actually lost jobs over the 4 years of his presidency. So we averaged a loss of 56,000 jobs a month, added 121,000 under Obama, added 14,000 under the George W. Bush. And just so that you don't think that we cut it off for anything other than we just don't have room to go all the way back in terms of presidents, we would not be afraid to show President Carter's 250 jobs a month added because it dwarfs any Republican president. The unemployment rate has been staying between 3.4 and 3.6%. It was 3.6% in February. It's 3.5% in March. And you can see how it's come down. And this is the U3 unemployment rate. And if I sound like a broken record, the U3 is the rate of people who are looking for work, have actively looked for work in the last 4 weeks, but have not worked any in those 4 weeks. So they're counted as unemployed on the U3 rate. In the U6 rate, it's a slightly broader definition. It includes people who are not working, who've looked for work anytime in the prior 12 months. And it also includes people who are working part-time that want full-time jobs. Now, most people who are working part-time actually want part-time jobs, but especially in recessions, we tend to get a bigger number of people working part-time that want full-time jobs. The rough numbers, and I'm doing this out of my head, so I haven't looked at them, is you have about 27 million people working part-time, and about 5 million of them want full-time jobs. Okay, so we'll throw in, if we have any Trump fans here who remember when President Trump in late 2019, his administration was talking about how the lowest Black unemployment rate ever at 5.3, 5.4%, actually was going up before the pandemic hit. I'm not quite sure why. But in any case, the unemployment rate for Black or African Americans is down to 5.0%, so a new all-time low since we started tracking it back in the looks to be early 70s. The other thing to look at, we talked about the fact there were 236,000 payroll jobs added. That's from the establishment survey. Household survey is where they call people and call households and say, how are you doing? Are you working? Are people in the household working? It's where they get that employment rate, but it's also has good numbers here that the number of people, the labor force grew by 480,000, which is a good big number. And the number of people who said they're employed actually grew by 577,000. So these two combined mean that the unemployment rate ticked down a little bit, about that 0.1%. And the other thing is the labor force participation rate and the employment to population ratio ticked up a little bit. So, and this has been true for a couple of months now, that the unemployment rate is going down for good reasons, not bad reasons. The employment to population ratio is now above the pre-pandemic high of 80.6%. It's at 80.7%. So this is, again, good data. And the other thing with all these people coming into the workforce is that it tends to not have as much upward pressure on wages from an inflation standpoint. Now, if you're working, you prefer upward pressure on wages, but then you don't want it all to go away from inflation. So job openings are still greater than the number of people unemployed. Job openings are around 10 million, and the number of people unemployed are around 6 million. So, good ratio of openings to unemployed, not as good as it has been in some prior months, but still darn good. It's still an economy where if you're looking for work, there's a good chance you're going to find it. Now we're going to look, any questions on the labor market before we switch over to the budget? And if people are holding up their hands, I'll tell you, I can't see that screen. So, okay, again, President Biden's fiscal year 2024 budget is for the fiscal year that starts October 1st of 2023 and runs through September 30th of 2024. These are proposals. The House and the Senate are supposed to be preparing budgets. I think they're technically due April 15th. Don't hold your breath for them to come close to meeting that date, because I think President Biden's budget was about a month late as well. But some of the things he's proposing in his budget: increased spending, higher taxes on the rich and corporations, and then increased spending on a child tax credit, childcare and pre-K. You can see the various things here. So the taxes, if they all went through, would be increased revenue by 1.5% of GDP, and the spending would increase by 0.8% of GDP, which means the deficits would go down 0.7% of GDP. A great story if it were to happen. We'll see. Basically, it says the 10-year deficit would therefore decline by about $3 trillion versus the CBO baseline. Okay, so where does the money come from? Tax hikes, a minimum tax on billionaires. David, I'll have to say I haven't dug into the details. Is this a tax on realized income or on wealth?
I think the 25% minimum tax is actually on the income side. It's not a wealth tax. It's
Okay.
just so that when you hear the story of I think Warren Buffett and others were talking about it, how they pay a lower tax rate than their administrative assistants. That's what they're talking about, is instead of paying 8 or 10% for a billionaire relative to their income, there'd be a 25% minimum rate that they would pay.
Okay, well, that's got a better chance of passing. We're seeing increases in the payroll tax for wealthier individuals, allowing the Trump tax cuts to expire for those making over $400,000 a year, close the capital gains loophole for people making over $1 million a year, raise the corporate tax rate about halfway up to what it was under Obama. So this is where the money would come from. The like-kind exchange, I'm not sure how that works for real estate investors that are trying to, switch from one rental property to another. It may cause them to be, if you don't have that like-kind exchange quote loophole, people may tend to have to stay with the properties they own and not be able to move to properties that look like better investments. We look at the distributional effects. After-tax income goes up on people with the lowest incomes and goes down for people with the higher income. So a very progressive tax proposal. And as we see, it would tend to increase the deficit in the near term, lower the deficit over the course of 10 years. By contrast, the Republicans really don't have a plan. So the best we can do is the Republican Study Committee put together a plan, but it does not have the support of all Republicans in Congress by any stretch of the imagination. It would cut Social Security, Medicare, especially Medicaid, CHIP, Obamacare subsidies, other mandatory spending. This is the infamous plan to balance the budget in 10 years. Pretty much would never get any support. So, but it's the only thing we have out there for what any Republicans say they support. What is responsible for the growth in the U.S. debt ratio in the last 20 years? We've got the Bush tax cuts and extensions of those. We've got the one-time spending for COVID and we've got the Trump tax cuts. So the Trump tax cuts are adding, but not nearly as much as a lot of other things that have added.
Hey, Carl, can we ask a question?
Certainly.
On the Bush tax cuts, can you remind me of why that is so heavy on that slide? I don't recall. I know the Trump tax cuts I thought were huge, but it looks like Bush tax cuts were the main culprit here.
Well, I mean, the Bush tax cuts were basically lowered the rates for pretty much everybody. And initially, Obama continued all of them to avoid going back into a recession, and later let the tax cuts for the highest income individuals lapse, but then let the tax cuts for lower and middle income folks remain. And so that's why they're still there. And then the Trump tax cuts restored the lower tax rates for the higher income individuals. Is that a fair way to put it, David?
I think so, yes. The only statistic I would add to that is that Obama extended about 80% of the dollar value of the Bush tax cuts.
Okay.
By letting the tax cuts expire for I think it was over 200 or 250,000. That was actually 20% of the revenue. It just tells you how much revenue comes from that top group, like that top 1% group at the time. Now that may be 400,000, but back then it was more like 250, I think. And you know, that's kind of where it is. It's a great question, because when I'm looking at that now, I would expect that the Trump tax cuts would be closer in size, at least in their current impact. I think part of understanding this chart is a cumulative effect, meaning that this chart is sort of the debt to GDP ratio. And so over the Bush tax cuts of, I guess 20 years now to add to that number. And the Trump tax cuts haven't had very long. So I would think that it's not going to be exact, but if the Trump tax cuts are going for another 20 years, they will be, that block, that tan or light orange block will be almost as, will be as big. It will be comparable in size. It's just that, again, it's this cumulative idea. Both of them probably add a similar amount in a given year. Call it 2% of GDP, somewhere in that range. And a percent of GDP, we have a 26 trillion economy. So a percent of GDP is like $260 billion. So 2% of GDP would be like 500-ish. And maybe it's a little less. Maybe it's 1.5% of GDP. But I bet they're both probably fairly similar. They're adding a fairly similar amount every year. It's just the Bush tax cuts have been running for 20 years, so they've made a bigger impact on this debt to GDP ratio, which is a cumulative measure.
Okay, I'd forgotten that this is cumulative, but that explains it. Okay.
The other thing that this chart shows, that when Bush said that Reagan's tax cuts was voodoo economics and that tax cuts pay for themselves through increased economic activity, nope.
It was the other Bush, but yes.
Yeah. So would we expect that the purple area here, the one-time COVID-19 and the Great Recession measures, would we expect that to go down in 5 years or 10 years to be a smaller portion?
I don't need to be a smaller portion unless the overall block is growing, but we would expect that it's not really growing much anymore.
Not growing. Okay.
That's right. It would be like the same size, but you're likely your stack is going to be taller.
Well, you can literally see that in the chart. All other debt, right?
Yeah.
During the boom time in around 2020, that ratio went down.
Nice. Thank you very much.
Okay, so let's go talk about Social Security and Medicare funding. We had some scary reports about how their trust funds will run out of money at various points in the future. We first started hearing about trust funds, 20 years ago, we heard about trust funds running out of money in 2034. It was like, oh, that's a long ways off. Now 2034, 2032, whatever, isn't that far off. So we've got currently under Social Security, it's Old Age and Survivors Insurance Fund as opposed to Disability Fund. We've got 57 million beneficiaries. We've got the dedicated payroll tax paid by employees and employers. Unless you're self-employed and you get to pay the whole thing, as well as the interest on trust fund reserves. The tax is capped. You're only taxed on the first 160,200 of earned income, wages, et cetera. No payroll tax, no Social Security tax on unearned income, capital gains, et cetera. So if this fund is depleted in 2033, which is the current forecast, the then current payroll tax revenues would be projected to cover about 77% of scheduled benefits thereafter. Now, do we think that that means that all of a sudden benefits will get slashed? Or do we think that old folks who vote much more than younger people will go ahead and insist that the general fund make up the difference so we don't have a cut in Social Security benefits, at least for most people, the lowest 60 or 80% of the income. I think that you can probably get some support for cutting Social Security benefits for the Warren Buffetts of the world, but not for most other people. The disability fund right now, it's got a dedicated payroll tax and it's self-funded through a 75-year forecast window. So it's looking pretty good. Certain benefits are taxed. Basically, the question is, what happens when the old age and survivor insurance fund is depleted in 2033? You either have to cut Social Security benefits or you have to find another source of revenue. So the projection is that on a 75-year gap, revenue is short about 1.7% of GDP. Removing that cap would, without raising benefits, adds 1.1% of GDP to revenue. So it cuts to 1.7 down to 0.6. Raising the payroll tax by 1 percentage point would cover another 0.3% of the cap. And David, I'm going to ask a question again. On the removing the cap, is that continuing to only tax earnings, wages for Social Security taxes, or does that include widening the taxes to include capital gains taxes?
Yeah, this is just wages, just removing that wage earned income cap.
Okay. So there's potential for additional revenue if the base gets expanded to include capital gains taxes.
So a question about that 160,000, is that per person or per family?
Per person.
Per person, yeah, per wage earner.
Okay, so if they remove that cap, is it up to the person whether they want to pay in up to 160 or greater? And what's the benefit to somebody for paying in more? Do they get more?
No benefit. It's
no
strictly
benefit.
Tax, right?
But they do get a tax benefit from it. Okay.
No, they get taxed. There's no tax benefit. They get that extra income that is getting taxed, and it goes into the fund to help pay for that, cover that gap in the revenue and the expenses that are expected as the country ages. There's more elderly per worker, and so workers have to pay more in if you try to solve the problem from the revenue side. If you choose to cut some benefits for some people or raise retirement age, which is a kind of benefit cut, there's all kinds of different ways that you can address Social Security. This is just trying to give you an idea of the magnitude, and if you wanted to not cut benefits, how much taxes would have to go up.
Okay, so
for background, the 160,000 is about the top 6% of wage earners make more than that. And the tax would only go up on the amounts over 160. So if you only make 170, you're not going to be paying that much more in taxes. But if you make $1 million, you're going to be paying a lot more in taxes.
Thank you.
So Medicare is in general, most people think that funding Social Security is the easier problem to solve. Funding Medicare becomes more difficult, although we've slowed the increase in healthcare costs, so it's not as difficult as it used to be. Plus, COVID killed off a lot of the really high-cost people. So, as we point out here, beneficiaries who died from COVID had been sicker than average even before they were infected. So the survivors are expected to cost less, down in the notes at the bottom. But a lot of people are enrolled in Medicare, and it is expected to have its fund depleted in 2013, after which the program can pay 89% of the cost thereafter. Biden claims that his tax and spending changes would extend the trust fund life by 25 years. So we get out to 2056. I'll be dead, so I don't care. The supplementary medical insurance beyond Part A, the hospital fund. Part B is physician and outpatient, the first 80%. Part D is prescription drugs. So I guess the one thing I would say here for anybody who hears about Medicare for All is what they're proposing is not Medicare. Medicare has premiums, Medicare has deductibles, and if you don't get a supplemental policy, you have a fairly large out-of-pocket. or actually no cap on the out-of-pocket max. So, but it's still, it's still a solid program and good to have. It's just not the magic elixir that the people selling Medicare by all claim it to be. They really are trying to propose something other than Medicare and call it Medicare because people like Medicare. Technically, what's closer to the proposing is actually Medicaid for all, because Medicaid doesn't have premiums, copayments, deductibles. Hey, we're making decent progress. So do you want to handle inflation, David, or?
Sure. I hate to
You wanna-
break the
you wanna
momentum,
share
but
your-
let me see if I can do it here.
And
Tell me if you guys can see that.
I can see it. We're just not quite in presentation mode yet.
All right, let's do that.
So were there questions anybody had on the first sections? Is everyone being shy?
How about now? Can you guys see the, is it in presentation mode?
Yeah, yes.
Good, all right. Yeah, and I figure we just, for the newbies, we usually take a break around 8 o'clock. So we will do a few more things here. Please stop me at any time if you have questions. So this slide shows inflation, the monthly change. So how much more expensive were prices in this month versus last month? And we're about to get the inflation data for March, literally tomorrow. So this is just showing you February, like what Carl was showing you for the jobs were through March, because we get that report like the first Friday of the month or very early in the month, like around the 5th-ish. So this is a month old, but it shows that the inflation, if you look at that left-hand side of the first few months of the year for 2022 versus the last half of 2022, sort of night and day difference of much higher monthly inflation rate. And sort of July, June, July was that inflection point where inflation really came down. But, it pops up every now and then, and 0.4 was still a pretty fast reading. If you kind of mentally multiply that times 12, if I can do that myself, what is that? Almost 5%, 4.8%. So that's kind of we want inflation to be closer to 2%. Yeah, but if you look at that average, sort of I've drawn this line here of July to February. If you take a look at that time period, it's average 0.29 a month, 0.3. So if you multiply that times 12, you get 3.4% annualized, much less than the 9.7 for that period ending in June. And it doesn't show January on here, but I included that in the math. January to June was a 9.7 annualized. So definitely it's slowing down. This shows the price level compared to a year earlier in percentage terms. So the last slide was versus prior month. This is versus a year earlier. And the blue line shows it includes everything. That's the CPI all. So it's got food and energy in there. Those tend to jump around a lot. And so that inflation usually is higher than what's called the core, which takes out that food and energy impact. And so we've seen here, we're down now. It's been coming down from a peak in June where the blue line was at 9%, and it's come down to where prices are about above where they were a year ago. And for the core, about 5.5%. And so they're saying things like the all items index increased, This was the smallest 12-month increase since the period ending October 2021. You see things like that. It's down from this peak of 9. All right, going on. This is a combination.
So David,
yep.
Can you go back to that slide for a second? So we've had inflation now for what, 2 years running? Not just 1 year.
Oh yeah. 20. When did we start really? I might ask Carl for my lifeline. I think it was mid 21. You really started.
Well, depends on what you look at. The economy collapsed and shut down in the second quarter of 2020, basically. President Trump asked the governors to order, everyone to stay home from work, to stay home from school, to minimize your going out. And the economy basically shut down at that point, and prices dropped. I was getting skinless, boneless chicken for $1 a pound, eggs for 50 cents a dozen. Demand dropped significantly back in those days. And then since then, so really inflation started to pick up in the second half of 2020. And I'd have to go back and look, but I'm thinking that the monthly inflation at the end of 2020 is similar to what we've had in the last 6 months. Let me try and pull that up and see if I can get it.
The prices actually declined for a while during that. When the pandemic hit, the prices, we had deflation. Prices were lower than they'd been a year earlier. And looking at this commentary is updated through January, not February. So that's why these numbers 6.456 are off. I always tell this to, I always say this to Bill, there's always one slide that I mess up and I don't catch it until the presentation. There's always like one, not two, not three, there's one. So this, I didn't update this text down here. It's from the prior slide, month slide, but same idea, except these numbers would just be, all items would be 6.0 and the 5.6 would be 5.5 now. It didn't change very much. This is the commentaries for January, and then February is where the latest data.
So as we get over the next 3 or 4 months, where it was really high in March, April, May, June of 2022, we should actually expect the percent increase or change from last year to go lower, right?
Right.
Because it's so high there.
Right. That's right.
And
economists spend so much time wondering about, they look at this, and this is what tends to be the headline. Like everybody sees this. The thing that economists are concerned about is, they don't want these monthly changes to be more than like a 2% annualized rate, right? Like this 0.29 times 12 months, the average of these last 6-7 months was a 3.4 annualized. So they look at that and they say, this is a little high. They probably like November, December. And then when it popped, like December to January, that scared some people. And then 4 is still, 0.4 times 12 is 4.8%, still pretty high. So economists are probably watching more of this statistic, this page, whereas what you see in the news and the headlines tends to be this. I mean, keep in mind, as you're pointing out, Bill, prices were higher in 2022 than 2021, and they're higher now than they were a year ago. I mean, inflation tells us that the fact that there's non-zero inflation, there's inflation, tells us that that price level is still rising. It's just when you measure versus a year ago, it's not as bad. We were starting with a smaller base and we jumped up, and now the inflation rate is still, it's down a little bit, and these numbers continue to fall, and they have. Looks like the blue line has fallen every month since June, hasn't it? Looks like every month. And the red one as well. So inflation is slowing. It's still high when you look at these numbers. It's still higher than the economists would like. And where would they like to see it? 0.2 times 12 would be 2.4%. That's where you'd want to see these monthly readings going forward. And we'll see and we might not have as much detail in this presentation, but when you look at some of the prior ones, rent, and we'll talk about it in this one too, rent is driving a lot of this. And so if rental inflation based on some more current measures looks like it's falling, we may be able to see some months with negative inflation. In other words, below zero. Like July actually rounds to 0.0. It actually was very slightly negative. So prices were lower in July than they were in June. And we may see that coming up in the months upcoming. It's just hard to get a good reading on when the latest rental data is going to hit the government statistics because they lag a little bit. And we've tried
like 12 to 16 months, according to the article that I had from Northwestern Mutual Insurance.
Yeah, I keep seeing different estimates. I've seen 6 months a year. Now you're saying 16. I've not. There's no definitive answer that I've seen. But what we are seeing, and goes back a few months, I'd have to look at it. When the government has a blend of rents that were agreed upon like a year ago and the current rents that are being agreed upon today. Some of the private sector measures look at the current rents of what are being offered today for places. Those prices have fallen. And so you're seeing, charts like this that they would show rent by month are actually showing negatives. And it just hasn't hit the government data yet. So, as we've talked about, there's a whole cottage industry of economists trying to figure out what's the real rate of inflation. It's fun, but it's higher than the Fed wants it. It's higher than it should be.
I need to point out something. There is space for houses and apartments. So we have to get used to the concept that housing prices will always rise, will hit some rising slope and will be going up forever because there is no limit. Unless we can develop a space warp and get 2 houses in the space of 1 house because of shortage, because of availability, housing prices will have to rise on an absolute basis forever. And somebody's got to figure that out. Somebody's not as stupid as an economist is.
I don't know, if you go to Reno, Nevada and drive east on I-80, you don't see anything looking like a shortage of space.
New York.
We don't have to live in Chicago, New York, San Francisco. People can live spread out in more rural areas and areas where there's more room to build homes.
That will ameliorate the problem, will not eliminate it.
The other thing I would point out, the link that I just posted in the chat, it attempted in this article, fairly longish post, that they basically that rents tend to lag, home prices and rents come into the inflation calculation with a lag of 12 to 16 months. So while they had strong increases in the late 2021 and early 22, they've been falling of late. And if tying it all together, if you remove the shelter component from the inflation and just look at current measures for goods, most services, commodities, excluding food and energy, inflation has been up 0.72% over the last 8 months, or a 1.08% annualized rate, which is below the 2%. So
coming down because it went up so fast before. I'm talking about long term. I'm talking about over 5 or 10 years. Housing costs will always have to be going up because of limited supply.
okay, I mean, I've seen housing prices go up and down over the course of my lifetime, especially in
For almost 50 years. So what you're saying makes sense. And, there are cities that have these zoning restrictions, so they don't build houses, so prices go up like crazy. And as Carl mentioned, in some of the rural areas, there's a lot of space, and as long as suburban sprawl is allowed, that allows the supply to keep up. It's a function to a certain extent of the restrictions that the government puts on how much housing can be built in a particular area. And the cities tend to be the ones where there's just prices go crazy because there is just a finite amount of supply.
You increase suburban sprawl, it's going to increase the amount of fuel needed for travel. So that's going to have its own issue because more fuel will be needed for that. I mean, there are issues with that too. I mean, and like I said, living in Scottsdale is not equivalent to living in New York City. There's no metropolitan Scottsdale for cultural activities like that.
Yeah. No, it's funny to see like these articles in the New York Times every now and then they sort of chronicle the story of somebody trying to buy an apartment or a condo. I don't know if you've seen these, but like they're always like, 1-bedroom apartment for 1.5 million, studio for 875, and it's like, really? I mean, it's unbelievable compared to, what you can get in a suburb. You can get a big mansion in the suburbs for what you pay for these little tiny apartments in New York.
I remember when I was working in New York 20 years ago, and you actually saw the real estate ads in the New York Times physical paper. They had, nice ranch houses advertised in the New York Times at the time for, 300,000-400,000, typical suburban prices. Now, did I mention that these were a 2-hour bus ride over across New Jersey to the Poconos? And so they were advertised in neighborhoods where you could live in the Poconos, catch your bus in the morning over to the Port Authority bus terminal, and then use the subways to get to wherever you had to go to work.
There was a story on YouTube living in the city, and so therefore that means the price of a house in the city is going to go up a whole lot more because of limited resources.
Well, except as we talked about, now that guy that bought his house in the Poconos doesn't necessarily have to go to the office every day.
And then over here is the 12 months. So this just gives you a look at it, and you can see kind of what's driving it at any given time. One thing about inflation is it's been driven by different things at different times. You had oil, gas prices were driving it for a while. You had really early on, it was cars, and then it's changed, and I'll show you a slide on that in a little bit, but you can see where some of these numbers like used cars and trucks used to be a big deal, and now those prices are almost 14% below where they were a year ago down here. So it continues to vary, but some of the things that are consistent, like food, rent, that's shelter, rent and housing down here. And transportation services is a wow section. Rental cars, insurance on your car, and car repairs are 14% more expensive than a year ago, almost 15. So, these are, rent is a much bigger part of it. Rent is like a third to half of the inflation we're seeing. The transportation services is much smaller, but it's a big number. This chart shows you contribution to inflation over time by component. So it's got food, energy, core goods, core services, less shelter, and shelter. And so you can see let's look at shelter. It's a really big component of inflation in the fourth quarter of 2022. It's like half of it or more. And it has been a lot recently, but still right now it's really big. This orange piece has disappeared more or less. Core goods at the beginning of the crisis, during the crisis, people weren't spending on services, but they bought a lot of goods. And so prices of goods went through the roof, and now people are spending on services, and that's pretty much gone away. So you see these kind of trends of something becomes big. Here's energy became a big deal even through early 2022, and then it's gone. It's actually a negative right now. So I love this chart. I think it really shows a story of how inflation has sort of, it's like a relay race where it like hands off to the next to the next relay race, like the mile relay where each person's got a quarter-mile run. It's one thing is handing off to the next. And hopefully we'll get shelter down. Carl said it may be we have to wait a little while, but we know that some decline is coming, but energy might come back before then. You heard Saudi Arabia, the OPEC countries are going to be cutting supply, and that'll likely raise prices. So we would expect the revenge of this blue section at some point coming, whereas that shelter, we hope we get a break on that coming up soon.
Well, the other thing to look at it is the Fed could recognize that shelter is truly negative now and just, read the inflation number without the green portion of the bar.
Right.
And what you see is that inflation is then at 2% or a little bit over 2%, and they don't need to raise interest rates anymore.
It's a great point. All right. We see inflation as a global phenomenon, not just in the US. The US is the orange line here. So we've come down, but the EU and the UK are still climbing. We're coming in the right direction. They're going up. And this is the 12-month change. So that's why you see that trend coming down. This is percent versus a year ago. Even Japan, of all places, is seeing some inflation. So it's really, it's a global thing, and it's not just here. And so when people analyze it and explain causes as being a U.S. policy, it takes away from that argument. It's hard to make the argument when people that aren't under U.S. policy have the same problem. Now to the extent that everybody did the same thing, like a lot of countries ran big stimulus programs, then you could say, okay, well, if you want to make it an argument like that, but it isn't just us.
Well, you'd see those very steep lines in the first half of 2022 after Russia invaded Ukraine.
Yeah, right here.
So David, why did you single out Japan?
Just because, over the years, people always talk about how the Japan economy is this very flat kind of unchanging economy with a very aged population. And they do, their Federal Reserve does a ton of money printing to buy their debt. And they have typically a very low unemployment rate. I mean, it's a very sort of stable, low unemployment rate economy. And for the first time, probably, this is only the last few years, but probably going back even further, the issue with Japan used to be deflation. So prices falling. So this is unusual to see Japan starting to pop. And I haven't dug into it. It just, it's interesting that it has. I don't know to the extent that Japan recently has been running large stimulus programs. And in the U.S., as you know, we've cut the deficit a lot versus where it was in 2020 and 2021, because a lot of those big spending programs didn't happen again. And you would think that would bring this inflation down and contribute to it, and it has, along with the Fed raising their interest rates. But to answer your question, it's just Japan with inflation jumping is just unusual. It's usually a very boring economy.
Can I ask, what is driving Canada down so far?
I don't know.
Well, it seems to be tracking the U.S. very similarly.
Imitating what we do, I'm just curious.
Better at it. If they're imitating, they're better at it. That's what I'm saying. What are they doing? Because they're better at it.
And it's interesting that the other people, it's interesting with the EU and the UK, they're still climbing while we're coming down. I just haven't dug into it enough to know exactly what it is. If the EU is maybe facing a bigger energy crunch than we are, because they are, like, our natural gas is not crazy here, but maybe because of the war, and they're more dependent on Russia over there, they are facing higher energy costs, and the UK as well, and are still going. But I'll take it as a to-do to dig into it and try to understand, what's driving the differences. I do suspect the EU and the UK is about energy. We're seeing gas prices falling and natural gas not crazy. I think that's different there.
Yeah, the price of gas in Canada is currently higher than the US, so maybe they don't have as much inflation, but they just have higher prices.
Yeah, all right. We'll dig into it. That's a good question, but it makes sense that all right. Let's take a look at this. This is the Fed's preferred measure of inflation. And in the upper right corner, this is what they call the PCE, personal consumption expenditures. And in this measure, it reflects the fact that people can substitute their goods. The usual headline inflation you hear about, the CPI, doesn't account for substitution. It's the same basket of goods. It also has a wider scope of items. It's not so much just urban, but it's rural as well. And it's weighted differently across the types of goods. So the Fed likes this as a more realistic measure to them. And so we've just given you a computation here. This is take 3 months of changes, average that. So you have one, an average for a month based on the last 3 months, multiply it by 12. So it's an annualized rolling average sort of, if you take the last 3 months, average that times 12, what do you get? And that's what you get. The 4.8 and 4.2. So a little bit lower than the other measures, but still high. The Fed wants to get this down toward 2.